You're listening to Beyond the Endpoint, a podcast from the Duke Clinical Research Institute. In this series, we're demystifying clinical research and answering your pressing questions about health and healthcare. You can find our full episodes at dcri.org/BTE.
Every day, the news is filled with reports about the latest medical breakthroughs, public health concerns, and emerging trends in health and wellness. But how much of what we see in the news is accurate, and what's missing from this conversation? My name is Emily O'Brien, and I'm an associate professor at Duke. I'm joined today by my co-host, Manesh Patel, who's a cardiologist that I work with. We're excited to bring you our first episode of a new series we're calling Beyond the Headlines.
Yeah, thanks, Emily. So we've been sort of developing our podcast and planning some of our episodes. And one thing that we noticed is that there's a lot of topics making headlines day to day that we wanted to discuss more informally, which is what we're going to do today. If you find that some of these are worth a deeper dive, we can revisit these on full episodes later. And really, it's meant to be a conversation, but hopefully, as you're seeing them and thinking of them, you can see the way we think about them, and at least from some of our scientific background. So, Emily, you worked with our production team to identify some of the health and clinical related topics making headlines recently. You want to kick us off?
Yeah, let's jump in. Manesh, you may have heard about this drug called Ozempic.
Yeah, really. I guess everybody has heard of, these weight loss therapies or shots, whether it's Ozempic or Mounjaro or different ones. Those are the commercial names. The drug names are semaglutide or tirzepatide. These agents are known to, I think, a lot of clinicians and patients because they clearly have been quite remarkable, at least in making people lose weight.
Exactly. Yeah. The study that we'll talk about was published this month and took a really interesting and robust approach to a question that actually had nothing to do with weight loss, which is what I think we all know Ozempic has been increasingly used for. This headline said, Ozempic can curb drinking, new research shows, and it's from the New York Times on February 12th. And it's an overview of a study that was published in JAMA Psychiatry, once weekly semaglutide in adults with alcohol use disorder, a randomized clinical trial. These researchers were asking whether this drug, Ozempic, could help people drink less. So this drug has actually been around for a while. It was approved for type 2 diabetes in late 2017. And I'll just stick in a little side note here. Similar to 99.4% of drugs that were approved from 2010 to 2019, semaglutide, the generic of Ozempic, was developed in part thanks to NIH-funded research, which, of course, we know is now on the chopping block, so to speak. So write your senators and make your voices heard about the importance of that research. So Ozempic, approved for type 2 diabetes. It was for a few years sort of kind of in the background, so to speak, quietly helping people manage blood sugar. And then people started to notice some interesting side effects. And these were side effects that not only were not necessarily bothersome, but actually people really were happy about them, right? The first major one is that people are noticing that they lost weight, and a lot of weight, like more than any other kind of pharmaceutical intervention that had been studied to date. And so this was a super surprising finding to people who knew the pharmacobiology of this drug, since it's a drug that slows digestion and reduces hunger. But what ended up happening is people were excited about these anecdotal reports and sort of observational data showing this weight loss. And so prescriptions, of course, as we all know, went way up. And so all of a sudden, the market really expanded to not just our type 2 diabetes populations, but lots of people who were using the drug for weight loss. And when you expand from a small population to a big population, sometimes you see even more surprising things when more people start taking this medication. And so that's what happened here. The internet was abuzz with stories about people who'd taken this drug for type 2 diabetes or weight loss and said, you know what, I'm not just eating less, I'm also drinking less alcohol, smoking less, shopping less. Some people said, I've had lifelong problems with shopping addictions or gambling or whatever, and those are just gone. Obviously, some anecdotes here that are frequent enough that people started paying attention. And one I thought that was interesting, a person on Reddit who said, these drugs are really expensive, but I can actually justify the cost because I'm saving so much money by not gambling. So I saw multiple benefits from this. Physicians were obviously hearing these stories in their offices, and endocrinologists who know the basic science were like, We look back at animal studies of these GLP receptor agonists, which is a class of medications. Those are consistent with this thought that maybe these drugs are effective for reducing alcohol and nicotine consumption. So this sort of started building up, and people said, okay, this is something that we really should be studying in a randomized clinical trial.
How does this work? Because there's all kinds of drugs where we notice like it's purported to have a benefit or have a side effect. How do we figure out if this is real, or how did they figure it out?
Yeah, this is a real challenge because the best way to approach this is to use actually a design that we're going to be talking about for this study, which is a randomized trial. And the beauty of that approach is that it results in an even distribution of characteristics in two groups. And we'll talk more when we get to our third study for today about why this is so important. But basically, what we're trying to do is make sure that treatment groups are comparable on important things that might affect, say, their weight loss or their gambling outcome, shopping addiction, whatever. Randomization is really the only guaranteed way to get there. In my world, we do a lot of observational research where we just ask people to tell us what they're taking and what they're doing, and then we try to adjust for any differences using other data. The classic example would be like breakfast is good for your health. In order to really study that, we either need to randomize people to eat breakfast or not, or we need to make pretty darn sure that the breakfast eaters are similar to the non-breakfast eaters on things like whether they smoke or whether they go to the gym 3 times a week or whether they get 8 hours of sleep a night. So randomization does that for us, but we have other methods for looking at observational data and saying, okay, we can use statistics to address any differences that we might see between, say, people who take Ozempic and people who don't. So that was part of the foundational data for this, but we really didn't feel like we had a definitive answer given that it was not from a randomized design.
What we often say is the God's gift of randomization. It's the only way we know that there weren't biases ahead of time. If you get enough people, gamblers in each group, or people potentially at risk for gambling, so that once they got the therapy, you could measure to see if they gambled less. Without it, you're always asking for people to remember the past or try to recall what happened. So there's all kinds of things like that. And then I'll just say the other thing from a medical standpoint here, a lot of people right now are asking, well, what does research get us? What does it mean? The idea that this molecule that was found, I think, from the gut of a lizard or a Gila monster or one of these lizards that had this receptor or this glucagon like peptide, a molecule found in the gut that goes to your brain and tells your brain you've had enough or you're satiated, then translates to, we've got a drug that goes to that same receptor to block it and block the urge to want to eat as much, maybe, and do other things. And so when we think about these kinds of questions, it's valuable to recognize that both at our own institute, at the Duke Clinical Research Institute, and other places, people are not just asking questions saying, hey, they're interesting. We're trying to say, okay, how would we really get to gold level evidence so we could recommend things?
Yeah, so they randomized people with alcohol use disorder that were not currently seeking treatment. This is, in my view, kind of like the right population, right? These are people who, for whatever reason, are not in the midst of any sort of clinical intervention to try to manage alcohol use disorder, but they meet criteria and could theoretically benefit from this drug if it were approved for their condition. So small study, phase 2 study, 48 people. The randomization of those 48 people resulted in two groups, people who were given low dose semaglutide and people who were given placebo. What they found is that people who were in the semaglutide group drank less in the lab setting. So they actually gave them some alcohol, their alcohol of choice, their beverage of choice, and let them drink as they would normally. But then they also measured things like cravings. And because there had also been anecdotal evidence of reduction in nicotine cravings, they also asked these people, how much are you smoking? And tried to see if that changed over time. What they found was that the semaglutide in this study did not reduce overall drinking frequency, but it did reduce the amount that people drank per session. The kind of overall takeaway is this drug might be helpful for alcohol use disorder, but we really need bigger studies. This was a preliminary study that showed some really interesting findings, but isn't quite enough evidence to begin prescribing this, say, in clinic at a large scale for everybody who's struggling with alcohol use issues.
I think it's encouraging, right? There's a lot of science that sometimes it's hard to know. Is it's encouraging a lot. I'll tell you, like a colleague of mine, Neha Pagadapati, who works in our prevention clinic at Duke, she sees a lot of these patients where they're prescribing these types of therapies. And she has told me that, at least in her anecdotal experience, that she's seeing people have less of these urges or have less of these kinds of things. What's really interesting is as we do studies like we're doing in our place or others, what we're really identifying, and maybe this is the biology, that it may be that It's not that they're not eating, they're eating less. It's not that they're not drinking, they're drinking less. It's not that all the urges are gone, but there's some curbing or satiation of it again. It's really exciting and interesting. And I think we're at a time in our country where pills aren't going to fix everything. And by no means do we want people to have to be on shots and have pills all the time. But I would say that there are a lot of people struggling with a lot of issues around weight and a lot of issues around gambling and drugs and issues like that. If there are therapies that can help, we're really excited to be able to study them. Although I'll tell you, boy, the number of people asking me, can I get that therapy? The biggest implementation issue for us right now are getting it to our patients, right? Getting it paid for, getting it covered, going through all the pre-authorization hoops. And I think this is going to continue to be one. We're at Duke. There's always interest in basketball. And unfortunately, this week we heard some concerning news, right? A lot of people probably saw in the Wall Street Journal on February 21st the rare medical condition that sidelined the NBA's next superstar, Victor Wembanyama, also known as Wemby. A really important story about deep venous thrombosis or clot in the veins to your legs. So he'll hopefully be back next year. And so whenever these kinds of high profile things happen, a lot of people ask us about DVT and things like that. And I'm sure you've heard about it too, Emily. I mean, I'm sure this probably caught your eye.
Yeah, I mean, my parents have been paying more attention to this. My dad retired last year, and he's been traveling more, and so I'll get questions about I need to worry about compression socks, and I think must be pretty interesting as a provider that you have sort of general prevention conversations, but that you probably see a real uptick when people see this in the news and then they come to you and say, hey, is this something I should be worried about? How does that change the discussions that you have with people in clinic?
It's always good to get awareness around conditions, right? And hopefully to help them. And as a cardiologist, I see some number of patients that have venous thromboembolism or VTE or deep venous thrombosis or DVT, which is what Wemby was diagnosed with. And knowing nothing about his case, but we know a lot about DVT or VTE. And what we know is that, and I tell patients this all the time, right? We all have blood that gets pumped from our heart to all of our body extremities, and then it comes back to our heart in these veins. So the arteries take blood away, the veins bring blood back. The farthest part the blood has to go is to your leg. So there's the longest road to get down to your ankle and to your toes. And the farthest part it has to come back from is way down there, back up to your heart. And these veins have little valves. So as the blood comes, almost like the Panama Canal, it gets through a certain part, there's a gate to keep it going. And as the muscles squeeze, the veins bring the blood back to the heart. So clots happen when at least we have traditionally thought of Virchow's triad, which is named by pathologists who say stasis, meaning the blood's not moving a lot, actually some breakdown of the wall if you had trauma or injury, and then sometimes some disruption of the cell wall. So these thrombotic issues happen when you might have some of these risk factors. Whether it's your father or others have asked me, I've got on a flight to Europe, what should I do? Should I wear stockings? What should I do? We know that, at least in meta-analysis, stockings don't seem to change the rate of having a clot in your legs, but we still think it's not unreasonable to wear them. I mean, sometimes in the cath lab, believe it or not, I'll wear those stockings because they just make your feet and your calves feel better when you're standing on your feet all day. But we know that moving around probably is good. And I know it's like an oxymoron because Wemby's moving around more than anybody else. So how does he get a venous thromboembolism when others don't? So I won't speculate on why he got it, except to say that these clots are things that can happen not just because of the veins in every individual can take a different turn. There are people that'll have clots happen because they also have anatomic issues that might be different. I will say that what we know is that the best way to treat these is with blood thinners, and those blood thinners help break up the clots so the clots don't go to your lungs. This is something other basketball player Chris Bosh had. I know, unfortunately, Serena Williams had potentially a DVT after childbirth. That's a little bit different because the pelvis and the veins there are also deep veins, and sometimes with childbirth, they've been compressed and can lead to a clot. Or some people also have anatomic changes that lead to compression of the vein, something called May-Thurner syndrome. So it's good to have DVT and PE in the news. I hate that Wemby's had it, but it's good for people to be aware of it so that they know how to potentially prevent it, which is mostly stopping, walking, and making sure you move around.
And for people who might have some of the risk factors that you mentioned, are there warning signs that they should be looking out for?
It's a great question. And so what are the risk factors? We know as you get older, maybe men have it a little bit more than women, but it can change. And then the immobility factors. You recently had a surgery, you were hospitalized. We worry a lot about it when people go through a knee surgery or a hip surgery. And we're worried a lot about it when people unfortunately have cancer because they can have a hypercoagulable state or a reason to have more clots form. What are the most common symptoms? It's swelling, but it's not just swelling everywhere. It's often swelling in your calf or your leg, and it's usually one leg, not both legs. Not to say you couldn't have a clot in both legs, but sometimes when both legs are swollen, it's more consistent with maybe, let's say, pooling of blood flow or just weaker veins. The second is acute shortness of breath that might happen. People started getting really short of breath when they've had a swollen leg. Now we're worried that the clot, which was in the leg, has gone to the lung.
So Manesh, what does this mean for the basketball future of Wemby? He's absolutely incredible athlete. I'm currently watching the Olympic basketball documentary Court of Gold, which is exceptional, highly recommended. And he's magnetic, incredibly fun to watch. But what does this mean for him as a 21-year-old phenom? You mentioned blood thinners. Will he be back? Is he able to manage this and return to these sort of high stakes athletics competitions?
Yeah, for sure. It's I don't again like I don't know all of his case, but I'll sort of tell you what the usual carrying course is for people who have a deep venous thrombosis, and talk about hopefully how we obviously want Wemby to be able to come back like a lot of individuals. So what happens when you have one of these clots is we usually put you on a blood thinner for 3 to 6 months, and usually it's about 6 months, and then we'll rescan to see if the clot dissolved and things like that, and then at the same time we'll be doing other evaluations, not in everyone, but in someone like him who's young and otherwise may not have other reasons, to see if they have proclivity to that with their how their blood clots in general before they were having this clot, or how their blood is functioning. And we call those hemostatic factors, or the way that the blood keeps moving without clotting. Then we'll also look at anatomic factors, and we'll look at family history and a variety of things. So I'm sure he's getting a huge workup. Hopefully all of that is clear, and then they'll do ultrasounds to make sure there's not like anatomic changes. God willing that all of that's clear, he would hopefully get treatment for some period of time and be able to come back in a year. But this is why when you're getting treated with a blood thinner for 6 months, you might not be able to play a contact sport like basketball. I'll just say as a side note, we've had people in our practice that are athletic that have clots, and not even obviously at the level of Wemby, but others will have a clot, what we call unprovoked. They weren't on a plane. They didn't have a knee surgery. They had a clot happen just out of the blue, and they want to go back to sports. They want to go back to regular living. And often in our clinical practice, what we'll do is do all this kind of test and evaluation I talked about, have the blood thinner on board, and then maybe be on an aspirin or something like that. There's less evidence for that compared to just being on the blood thinner. And then we have actually a whole set of other lower dose blood thinners we could use too. Usually right now what we do is do 6 months of treatment and then follow them every 6 months to say, let's do an ultrasound, and hopefully they're better off, and we're really getting people often in a year or two back to full activity.
Got it. Okay. And I know he'll be receiving excellent care as an NBA athlete.
Emily, there was like one more study out there about lifespan and ADHD. Maybe you can tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, thanks, Manesh. So the headline for this one is ADHD linked to astonishing reduction in life expectancy. And this is a summary of an article that was published in the British Journal of Psychiatry. So this is like a really high level, classic kind of population health study. They even use life tables, which that's a common old school epi method. And so I was like really excited to dive into this one. You may have seen some of these headlines that kind of blew up in my family group chat, because I have no fewer than 4 immediate family members who have an ADHD diagnosis. I have a big family, so nobody's identifiable, but we were certainly talking about this study and kind of what it meant. So it was out of the UK, and they essentially just looked at diagnosis data, so the codes that your doctor assigns when you come in for a visit based on whatever you're diagnosed with. And they compared people who had a diagnosis of ADHD with people who didn't, and asked a simple question, which is, how long do both groups live, and are there differences there? They actually found that the people with ADHD live about 7 to 9 years less than their peers without ADHD. There's actually like slightly more of a difference in women than in men. So 7 years in men, 9 years in women. And then the authors say we didn't have a ton of really detailed data here. So this could easily be due to things like having more smokers in the ADHD group, or people with worse access to healthcare, people with coexisting conditions. There are a couple things I loved about the study, a couple that I've been sending around to calm people down when they contact me about this, because I think it certainly, I wouldn't say this is like the final statement on ADHD and its impact on life expectancy. That's a mild way of putting it. But the good thing about the study, it was a large database. In the UK, they have the National Health Service. Primary care is free, so people can go in and get seen by a doctor and have their data in the system that then researchers can come and use to ask high-level questions like this one. This big study, about 20 million people in their analysis, but there was this small red flag that popped up pretty early on as I was reading this. And in this one, they found that only about 30,000 people had an ADHD diagnosis in this group. And do you know the prevalence of ADHD? What would you guess? What would you guess?
It seems like I'll say two things, and I'll just, again, as an epidemiologist, you'll have to tell me about this, right? Like, it seems like it's prevalent, and it seems like it's increasing in at least recognition or prevalence.
Yeah, those are both true. The other third point I would add is that it varies from country to country. In the UK, they said, based on what we know from other studies, we'd expect about 3% of these people to have a diagnosis. In the US, it's closer to 8 to 10%, and as you mentioned, increasing with time with increasing recognition. So my first sort of red flag on this is they only found 30,000 people. Based on those estimates, they really should have found about 500,000 people with this diagnosis. Their prevalence was about a ninth of what we would expect it to be, which, like, okay, maybe this isn't such a big deal as long as we have the right people in our study. But when we think about this from a research perspective, and our data science group at the DCRI talks a lot about this, which is the concept of selection bias. Are the people who are showing up with that diagnosis of ADHD somehow different from the, say, 470,000 that may not have shown up for whatever reason, but who we think probably are out there also with ADHD? This could be a problem if the people who are in the database have, for example, more severe diagnoses or are more likely to be seeking healthcare for other things, which is why their ADHD showed up in the data set. So it's something that I think is important to point out as, like, what is this group, this small selected group of people with ADHD, and are they somehow different? The second thing is, with this one, a big limitation is that they didn't have information on why people died. So this is a common limitation, in this kind of real world research, so to speak, is we're pretty sure that someone is, if they've died, we can count that as a death, and we're pretty confident in that classification, but we may not be able to say what they died from. And to me, the challenge is, if you're somebody with ADHD and you pick up this paper, that is the first question that you want answered, right? Is, okay, what exactly is going on here, and how might this translate into something I should be paying attention to or care about? So I think that's a pretty big limitation, and the authors acknowledged it, but to me, it just brings up more questions than answers.
It's a great example of two things that are, and I think, again, we want science to be informative. ADHD is increasing prevalence. It's really important. There's a lot of people who struggle with it and get therapy for it. And then we don't have a bunch of great long-term data. So how it affects people is important. The problem is to really understand that you need cause, effect, clear definitions, and you need, if you could, understand all the other things that might put people at risk. Is that fair?
Right, which is why research like this, I think, is so complicated, but also so interesting, because you obviously can't randomize people to having ADHD or not. Wouldn't be ethical, not possible. I think we can all see the challenge there. But you also have to be pretty confident that the comparison you're making makes sense and doesn't ignore a bunch of really important things, which brings me to my third and final point on this. And this is something that has just really grinds my gears about this study and other studies that I think could take a more robust approach to these kinds of questions. In this study, they used diagnosis codes from the primary care encounters to find people with ADHD. And this is a super common way to do this kind of research. Not perfect for sure, not the same as like having a medical record review by a physician, but like a pretty good way to identify people with a condition. They do say in their limitations that they didn't have information on comorbidities or other health conditions that people in this population had. But to me, like, we do a ton of this research in our outcomes work at the DCRI, where all we have are diagnosis codes, and we rely on those to identify things like type 2 diabetes or heart failure or history of cancer, et cetera. And for some questions, they work really well. And I think for this study, given that they had access to those data, I really would have liked them to use some method to identify some of the major risk factors through those codes that they could then use to really check this assumption that the two groups are comparable. Because to me, like, there's such a possibility of bias there that I think really undermines any firm conclusions that you might draw from this. And it seems like a small methods thing, but I think it really changes the way that someone should pick this up and interpret it, given that the two groups are likely still really different on important things.
Yeah, no, it was really good and a great walk through this. I thought it was a really important study. So Emily, this was really fun. I mean, we'll do this occasionally where we're like stuff's really heating up in the headlines or people want to know, and we're thinking about how the science is occurring or the trials are doing, and you get a little bit behind the headlines and maybe beyond the endpoints that they're reporting to say what does it mean.
Yeah, one thing we really want to illustrate here is that not all science is the same in terms of quality, in terms of relevance, in terms of impact for people. So really like the chance to get to dive in and think about whether those headlines are accurate or whether there's a little bit more to the story. So thanks for joining us for this episode of Beyond the Endpoint and our first Beyond the Headlines episode. If you have interesting headlines that you'd like us to discuss, please email us at beyondtheendpoint@duke.edu.
Yeah, thanks, Emily. This was really fun, and thank you all. We'll be back in a couple of weeks with another episode.
This has been Beyond the Endpoint. Resources related to this episode are available on dcri.org/BTE. If you have any burning questions about clinical research or healthcare, drop us a line at beyondtheendpoint@duke.edu. We'd love to address your questions in a future episode.